The wind carried the melody again, that same haunting lullaby, drifting through the sleepy town of Hollow Creek like a ghostly whisper. It crept through the streets, curling around the old lampposts and slipping through the cracks of tightly shut doors. Everyone knew what it meant. Another child would be gone by morning. Sarah Whitman sat in her dimly lit living room, staring out the window, waiting. She didn't know why she tortured herself like this every year, but she couldn't stop. Not since she lost him. Her son, Daniel, had vanished on this very night 5 years ago, leaving behind only his empty bed and the lullaby lingering in the air. No forced entry, no struggle, just gone, like the others before him. The town, as always, remained silent. They mourned, yes, but they never searched. Sarah had begged for answers, pleaded with the sheriff, the mayor, anyone who would listen. But they all looked at her with that same tired pity, shaking their heads and muttering the same line. Some things in Hollow Creek are best left alone. But Sarah couldn't leave it alone. She wouldn't. Tonight, as the lullaby drifted through the trees, she felt it stronger than ever, the air thick with something ancient and wrong. Grabbing her flashlight, she pulled on her coat and stepped outside, her breath curling in the cold autumn air. The streets were empty, lights flickering inside homes as parents clutched their children close. But not Sarah. She only had ghosts now. She walked toward the outskirts of town, to the Hollow Creek Historical Archives, a place most had long forgotten. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the shelves lined with yellowing records and crumbling journals. She combed through missing persons reports, birth records, anything that could help. That's when she found it, an old ledger, its leather cover cracked and worn. It detailed the operations of the Hollow Creek Orphanage, a place she had heard whispers about, but never truly understood. Sarah's heart pounded as she flipped through the pages. Children had gone missing then too, dozens of them, all on the same night, with the same eerie lullaby echoing through town. The orphanage's headmistress, Madame Crowley, had dismissed the disappearances in her writings, claiming the children had simply run away. But the last entry, scrawled in desperate, shaking handwriting, sent a chill down Sarah's spine. They hear the song, and they go willingly. The house calls them home. We must never speak of this again. Sarah's throat tightened. She had to know more. She followed the town's old maps, tracing the orphanage's location to the far side of Hollow Creek, where the forest grew thick and wild. Her flashlight beam trembled as she walked through the overgrown woods. Twigs snapped beneath her feet, and every gust of wind carried the faint, familiar tune. And then she saw it. What remained of the orphanage. The once grand building stood in eerie silence, its roof caved in, windows shattered. Ivy crawled up the stone walls like grasping fingers. But what made Sarah's blood run cold were the toys scattered across the ground. Small stuffed animals, a rusted tricycle, a lone shoe half buried in the earth. Sarah swallowed hard and stepped inside. The air inside the orphanage was stale, heavy with forgotten sorrow. As she moved through the crumbling hallways, she saw names carved into the walls, names of children long forgotten. But one name stood out. Daniel. Her knees nearly buckled. A sudden noise echoed down the hall, a soft shuffling sound. Sarah whipped around, but there was nothing there, just the darkness pressing in on all sides. But the lullaby? It was louder here, clearer, as if the walls themselves were singing. Suddenly she felt something cold brush against her arm. She spun around, and in the dim glow of her flashlight, she saw a movement. Just a shadow at first, lingering at the edge of her vision. Then another and another. Small figures, children, their eyes dark and hollow, their mouths whispering the lullaby in perfect unison. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled back, heart racing, but the children didn't move closer. Instead, they pointed, down the hall toward a rusted door hanging ajar. A low groan echoed from within, like a distant sob carried through the years. Tears burned in Sarah's eyes. Daniel? Her voice was barely a whisper, but the shadows only watched, waiting. She had come searching for answers. Now she wished she hadn't. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the lullaby once more. It twisted around Hollow Creek like a ghostly ribbon, seeping into every crack, every hidden corner. Sarah Whitman stood at the edge of the orphanage ruins, her knuckles white around the flashlight, heart pounding in her chest. The night was thick, suffocating. This time, she wasn't going to run. She stepped inside. The air was heavy with dust and decay, the faint scent of mildew clinging to every surface. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, and the eerie remnants of a forgotten past. The rusted remains of cribs, tiny shoes caked in dirt, made Sarah's skin crawl. The lullaby grew louder, seeping from the walls like a slow poison, and she swallowed the bile rising in her throat. She followed the sound down the hallway, past peeling wallpaper and crumbling portraits of children whose faces had been scratched out. At the end of the corridor, an old wooden door stood slightly ajar, the dark space beyond it pulsing with an unseen energy. Sarah's trembling hand pushed it open, revealing a spiraling staircase leading deep beneath the orphanage. She descended, each step colder than the last, her breath misting in the dim light. As she reached the bottom, her flashlight flickered, illuminating a vast chamber lined with stone walls carved with names, hundreds of names. Her son's was among them. "Daniel!" she whispered, tears threatening to spill. Then she heard it, soft footsteps behind her. Sarah whipped around, the flashlight trembling in her grip, and there she stood, Madame Crowley, tall, skeletal, wrapped in a tattered black dress, her lips curled into a sinister smile. "You shouldn't be here," Crowley whispered, her voice as smooth as silk and twice as deadly. "They belong to me now." Sarah's legs threatened to give out, but she stood her ground. "Where is my son?" Her voice cracked with desperation. Crowley's eyes, empty and soulless, gleamed in the dark. "Here," she said, gesturing to the back of the chamber, where a crib stood, rocking slowly on its own. Sarah's breath caught as she stepped closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. The crib creaked, and a small skeletal hand emerged from beneath a tattered blanket. Sarah stifled a scream, bile rising in her throat. The lullaby swelled, a mournful dirge of loss and despair. The air thickened, pressing in on her chest, and Sarah felt something cold wrap around her ankles. Dark tendrils slithered across the floor, coiling up her legs like hungry serpents. Crowley's voice turned sharp. "You cannot take him. He belongs to the house." Sarah gritted her teeth, panic clawing at her, but she reached into her coat and pulled out the locket she had carried every day since Daniel disappeared. The tiny photo inside, his bright smile, his innocent eyes, shimmered in the dim light. She held it up defiantly. "He's my son," she spat. "Not yours!" A deafening shriek filled the chamber, and Crowley lunged. Shadows exploded from the walls, writhing with a life of their own. Sarah staggered back, clutching the locket tighter. "You can't have him!" she screamed. The crib trembled violently, the shadows pulling Daniel deeper into the darkness. Sarah rushed forward, her fingers grasping at his tiny hand. "Daniel, I'm here," she sobbed. "Hold on." Crowley's hands clawed at Sarah, pulling her away with inhuman strength. But Sarah wouldn't let go. "I will not lose him again," she roared, using every ounce of strength she had left. The locket pulsed in her hand, a soft glow radiating outward, and suddenly, the lullaby faltered. The shadows recoiled with an agonized screech, and Crowley staggered backward, her form flickering like a dying flame. Sarah pulled Daniel into her arms, holding him tight as the chamber walls cracked and groaned, the curse that had plagued Hollow Creek unraveling around them. The air swirled violently, the names on the walls glowing with a ghostly light before fading into nothing. Sarah turned and ran, cradling Daniel against her chest, tears streaming down her face. The walls trembled, the orphanage collapsing behind them as she scrambled up the staircase. She burst into the night, collapsing onto the damp earth outside. Daniel clung to her, shaking. "Mom?" His voice was barely a whisper, but it was him. He was real. He was home. Sarah sobbed, holding him tighter than ever before. But as the wind howled through the trees, a faint, lingering melody still carried through the air. The lullaby was fading, but it wasn't gone, not yet. She looked back at the ruins of the orphanage, a cold shiver crawling up her spine. Hollow Creek's secrets had been buried deep for too long, and even though she had her son back, Sarah knew the town's darkness hadn't vanished completely. Somewhere in the shadows, Madame Crowley still waited, and next year, the lullaby might play again.